Um, okay, so welcome to our very first AIM Collective Conversations webinar. We're so excited to have you all here today. So today our speaker is Zach Hawes. We're just gonna let someone in here. And he has been kind enough to share his talk on paying attention to spatial reasoning in early mathematics from the Canadian Early Mathematics Education Conference in 2021. So hopefully you all watched his talk, or if not, you have a good idea of kind of what Zach researches. So I'm going to start with a question, and then after this, we'll open it up to everybody. So my very first question for you, Zach, is this video was 3 years ago now. Is there anything you would change or any new research you would highlight if you gave this talk now?
Yes. I went back and looked at the slides today, and the one thing that has really changed in my thinking is the difference between spatial visualization or even spatial thinking more broadly and imagery. I think oftentimes imagery and spatial thinking get grouped as one, but I've recently started to really look at imagery and its relation to spatial thinking. And it seems like there's two distinct types of kind of like the visual spatial imagination. You have like your visual imagery, and then you have spatial imagery. And I think when I was looking back at the slides, I think oftentimes I was conflating visual imagery and spatial imagery, but really I think what I was referring to is spatial imagery. So visual imagery is what you would kind of use to imagine the scene or the setting of maybe a book that you're listening to. Or if somebody's describing something in detail, you'd want to imagine everything in kind of high definition, in the most picturesque way as possible. But spatial imagery, which I think is much more related to kind of the concept of spatial visualization that I was describing, in some ways it's quite opposite. So it's stripping away all the picturesque qualities and really thinking about the details and thinking about, or sorry, not the details, but the, in many cases in mathematics, like the visual spatial relations, but not the kind of the visual imagery. It's about thinking about the structure or maybe the schematizing the thing in mind at hand rather than thinking about it in kind of, yeah, high definition. And so in the slides, when I was looking at it, there's that one example of how spatial visualization is related to mathematical word problem solving. And you saw there's a contrast between the kids that drew what I label as schematic images to the problem. So that they didn't draw like the hot air balloon and like all the high details, whereas the other group of children tended to draw all the details. It's the kids that kind of schematize and do away with the details that tend to do better in mathematical word problems and all sorts of other mathematical tasks and STEM thinking more broadly. In science, we see that all the time. It's not really about thinking about all of the details in the way that I think we often think about when people talk about imagery or even spatial thinking. I think oftentimes when people think about it, they are imagining visual thinking and not spatial thinking. So yeah, the long answer to your question is I've started to really think about visual thinking and spatial thinking in much more distinct ways than I think I did. I always knew that there was kind of a separation, but also a lot of overlap. And I would say now I think about them as even more separate. And specifically with regards to like mental imagery, I think it's becoming more and more important in my own thinking to differentiate between these. So I just finished a meta-analysis with Mariah Sokolowski, and we looked at the neural regions that are activated when people are thinking about kind of a static image. So just imagining an apple, for example, in as much detail as possible, compared to spatial imagery, where you're maybe imagining cutting that apple or transforming it, twisting it, turning, doing something to that apple to transform it. And it turns out that those two forms of imagery have actually very distinct neural networks. So you have kind of the dorsal pathway, the spatial pathway is related to the spatial transformations that you'd apply to objects. So the much more dynamic kind of schematic way of thinking spatially about problems. And then the visual imagery, so imagining that apple in high definition, high detail would be the ventral pathway, which again is more about object recognition and thinking about objects in a very visual way, not necessarily about spatial relations. And so that to me is even more evidence. So as I've been writing that paper, with Mariah and a few other people, it's again really kind of awakened me to these differences in visual thinking and spatial thinking. And yet, when you look at the literature, so often they're conflated. Like there isn't a paper that I read that it's not like they don't make this distinction. And yet, when you start looking at kind of the neural data, it's very clear that these are two very different ways of thinking about objects. Yeah, so that's an example of like how neuroscience for me has actually helped me think. Sometimes I don't think neuroscience adds anything to things that we couldn't have behaviorally tested, but this to me is a good example where the neuroscience has actually made me think about the behavioral relations differently because I had just assumed that they would activate the same regions and there'd be tons of overlap and mental imagery is mental imagery, but perhaps not.
I find that super interesting because I actually have aphantasia. So I don't know if
I
anyone
was going to
doesn't know
get
what
into
that
that.
is. That's when you don't have that imagery piece, but they're starting to
Mhm.
think now there are two types of aphantasia, which I definitely would agree with because I don't have the visual piece, but I do have the spatial piece. So everything you're saying like rings so true for me.
Yeah, so interesting. And yeah, aphantasia has only been kind of clinically defined since 2015. And that's where again, more of this research is convincing me that there's spatial reasoning is actually quite different than thinking in clear images. The way that you would if you had like hyperphantasia, for example, is when you think in like high imagery, you picture everything. Um, and it can often get in the way of mathematical problem solving or scientific thinking because again you're kind of distracted by all the details and so there's some interesting research showing that people with aphantasia actually are very good mathematical problem solvers and tend to go into the STEM disciplines at a higher kind of incidence rate than people with kind of your average mental imagery and it seems like maybe part of that has to do with just the ability to abstract the key details and not think about things in such a visual way. So yeah, that area of research is so interesting. And the fact that people with low, like they report having no imagery, still do really well on spatial tasks, that when you look at them, you'd assume there's a high visual component. Like that's another mystery that I'm currently looking at and I'm really interested in. Like, how is it possible to kind of perform so well above average on some of these spatial tasks that appear on the surface to be very visual, and yet that might not be the case? Yeah, Joanne.
Joanne?
That's really interesting, Zach, because I must admit, when I think about spatial processing and math, I never thought about it as visual imagery at all. And maybe that's because I'm a little bit like you, Leah. I wouldn't say that I
Mm,
have aphantasia, but I don't have elaborate, complex visual images. To me, I think the term that I've always preferred for the sort of category of skills that you're calling spatial reasoning would be something a little bit more abstract than that, like more like relational reasoning.
hmm
And the image part or the visual part is often that's presented to people in a visual form.
hmm
And I think that's why it's kind of misleadingly visual, but the visual is out there. It doesn't necessarily mean that the visual is in here, which is what
Yeah.
imagery is, right? Is the visual in here. And that connects to me, the patterning research with younger kids, where patterning has been shown to be related to math. To me, that's again, it's relational reasoning. It's not
hmm
the fact that it's, little pictures that's important. It's that you can pick out what the pattern is, or what you also mentioned, structure is one.
Structure, yeah.
So I guess I always kind of, I don't know that I ever thought about it that in the way you described it, but I always kind of assumed that spatial reasoning was kind of this more abstractive, relational kind of,
Yeah,
and
it'd
not
be
imagery
interesting to
at all.
survey like the field, see what people think. I think I have too. I mean, I think I've thought of it as in more of a spatial relational way, especially in the context of math. But then at the same time, I think I've also, in my own imagination, I often think of examples that are also very visual. And I think that's still where I'm struggling a little bit here is that some of my reading of the literature especially when it comes to like scientific discovery, that actually seems more like visual imagery. Like people are using it's kind of like metaphorical thinking. They're relating scientific phenomena to certain visual structure. So it's like a like the kind of, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Um, I can't think of a good example right off the top of my head of like a scientific one, but like even like Einstein's way of describing those thought experiments, they still seem very visual and not necessarily spatial, although there is a spatial aspect to it.
But maybe there
Um,
could be both, right? Maybe there could be some visual
yeah,
that sometimes is important and sometimes it's not, right? Like it you could have both. You could have both those dimensions in there.
yeah, and maybe it depends on what the problem is that you're trying to solve. Are you trying to invent something new, or are you trying to solve kind of a more well-learned problem that has a structure
Mhm.
that you're more familiar with? So yeah, I think it's interesting to think about when visual and spatial thinking collide and when they are separate, and maybe how they might differentially relate to different aspects of mathematics. And again, going beyond mathematics, more like the science as well, because it could differ. I'm reading a book by a mathematician, and this is also like the more I've read about like professional mathematicians, they describe their imagery in very visual ways too, which is again where I see like these personal firsthand accounts aren't necessarily so spatial. They're describing making sense of the mathematics by attaching it to images. And these are very well defined images. So it's an abstraction of sorts, but it's still, you're attaching it to like, yeah, this well defined image that I guess you're thinking about it in more of a structural way. But in these descriptions that I'm reading, they still seem visual. So again, yeah, I'm interested in learning more about this distinction.
That actually ties in really well to my next question. Sorry, Heather. Um, but so in the video, you had talked about this building with the mind's eye exercise. Um, and it was a very visual exercise, like a visual imagination exercise. The teacher had all the kids close their eyes, and she was like, imagine you have three of those green building blocks put together, and then you have blue ones, and then you flip it.
Hmm.
And she had all the kids closing their eyes. So I was thinking about myself as a child. I would have been like, well, this is dumb because it wouldn't have done anything for me. So how would you support a student, or how would you even identify a student who has low visual imagery?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you could do it with, so I'm trying to think of that exact example. I've seen so many different examples of that task. So that one they still had oh, it was all in the imagination. Yes. Oh, so I would do it where you actually have the cubes present. And so then it's less about imagining the visual aspect and it's more about the positional piece. So you'd have to be listening to like, oh, green goes on top of the red. So it becomes more of a spatial task. And that too is where I think things get really interesting in terms of the research. What can happen when you actually have the materials in front of you versus it's all in your imagination? So these internal visualizations and external visualizations might actually be and like relate to mathematics in quite different ways. Um, and at the same time, they might be correlated. Surprisingly, there's almost zero research on that, which I find kind of really interesting that we assume sometimes that what goes on in our minds, these internal visualizations, actually play out in the way that we use materials and manipulatives and diagram, all the things, our external thoughts, our external kind of ways of putting ideas out there in the world. They might be quite distinct. And I think aphantasia, again, has taught us a lot about that. So you have, who was it? Ed Cutmill, who was, I think he was wasn't he like the president of Pixar for a while? Like, I think he's the one that came up with like Little Mermaid, but couldn't sketch in his mind's eye. But as soon as he had a piece of paper, could come up with these amazing drawings. And then there's other people with these same accounts, like they can't imagine the workings of a motor, for example, in high detail. But then as soon as you have the manipulative or the tools in front of you, you can structure it and you can see how things kind of fit together and work. So I find that really interesting. And given that there's little research on that, I think it's a really promising area of future research. It's a really basic question. Does like internal spatial visualization actually relate to external visualizations that we use in math and science? And I can only find like a handful of studies, one of them being the one that was in the talk where they showed that people that have high spatial visualization skills based on mental rotation also tended to think more in diagrammatic, schematic ways. So there's some studies like that, but oftentimes they're not even that's not their question. They're not kind of broadly interested in this question of whether or not what we imagine in our own minds actually plays out in the way that we kind of think about these things in the real world. So yeah. So I would do things like that. I would take it outside of the mind and take the internal visualization piece and then let's put it out there in the world and start seeing what happens when we provide tools or manipulatives in that case and see what happens. So we've done that same activity with a barrier, but that you can see the materials and you're describing, okay, so take the blue one and put it beside the red one, to the right of the red one, right? So you're actually dealing much more in kind of spatial language and positional language. And it's less about kind of imagining these things in high visual detail. Although again, I would be curious to see like what is happening with that task. Is it more visual or is it more spatial or is it again a combination of both? It'd be interesting. We should try that.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Heather, do you want to give your question now?
Sure. I'm just kind of bouncing back to thinking about how you can parse out sort of what the spatial visualization or the visualization and the spatial, like sort of those two aspects, and wondering if how you would test that with kids to see how they're actually visualizing the problem. Like, would you be asking them questions? Like, what would just be a good way to parse
Yeah, I don't know because
in a
again,
study?
not many people have done it. I think diagramming is one you see in science. So there is much more done in science,
Hmm.
and you do see a relationship between kind of internal spatial visualization processes and then one's kind of capacity to think in diagrams, produce diagrams, interpret diagrams. So I know like Stan DeHaan right now is doing a lot with graphing and looking at, although not necessarily the relationship, but just the interpretation of graphs, and a lot of it seems to be quite spatial. Um, so I look at like whether or not there's a relationship between spatial visualization or various other spatial skills, and then their kind of capacity to produce different models, whether or not it's through sketching. I think you could look at sketches, drawings, diagrams. I think manipulatives are a great example too of where you see kids or adults use space. And here too, we start to think about space being used differently. Like, and you can start to see in the way that people are using manipulatives, for example, how they're using space, and perhaps how they're organizing it internally. For example, even counting, like really early counting. Young children often struggle with a one-to-one correspondence, but I'm kind of becoming more and more convinced it's actually just children not yet developing a way of structuring the objects to be counted in a spatial way. So there's that video that some of you have seen of my son, and the struggle was, in some ways, it seemed like the actual cardinality was there, but not the ability to actually, after you've counted an object, put it to the side or impose some sort of spatial structure so that you know which objects have been counted. So you're reducing the working memory and you're using space in a really great kind of efficient way of organizing the information. And I think the more we start to look at how kids and again adults use manipulatives, we start to see examples of how space has actually given us insights into how they're thinking about the problem. I mean, even arithmetic, we see the hand, like kids will use their fingers as a way of structuring the problem. So again, there we see a spatial scaffold. I imagine almost any time you have an external aid, there's going to be individual differences in how they use it. And a lot of those individual differences are tied to the way that they're using space. So I would even start studying it by looking at the relationship between these kind of psychometric spatial classical visualization skills and then seeing how it relates to kind of how kids structure space, how they use manipulatives, how they sketch or draw out different problems. What information are they abstracting? Are they abstracting it in a kind of spatial way or more of like a picturesque way? So I think that's the way forward. And I think there's lots of ways we could look at it, but not many people, at least explicitly, have looked at it. I think it's kind of there hiding but we haven't really started to look at how useful or how important that spatial structuring piece is. There's a really neat study of professional chefs looking at what they do differently than like an amateur chef, and it mostly has to do with the way that they organize space. Like they're
Mm.
just so efficient with putting things in certain spots so they know where they're going to reach. They have everything lined up. Um, and so that's also kind of, and there's other examples too of factory workers using space as kind of a great organizer and a way of making sense of what they're doing and basically just alleviating all the cognitive demands. So yeah, that's a good question. That's what I want to answer. I don't know what.
Yeah, and that's interesting as you're talking about the chefs lining things up and the factory workers. We're back to the kids, and it's so much easier for them to count things when they're in a row. And when you train them to count, you're training them to touch it and move it and name it and all that stuff to kind of give them that framework almost to do it successfully, to organize, yeah, which gets back to maybe the grids and organized
Yeah,
frameworks.
grids.
Just
Yeah,
really interesting. Yeah.
the
Thanks. That's neat.
structure. Yeah, the
Yeah.
structure.
Joanne has her hand up, I see.
Yeah, that makes me think of some work that we did in, 15, 20 years ago now. And we asked kids, we were looking at the counting principles, and one of the non-essential counting principles is the way that you count things.
Hmm.
So so in some of the early work, it was considered a counting principle, this idea that you could start anywhere. But if you ask a
Yeah.
5-year-old about that, it looked like the little kids had understood that, but they didn't really. It was the way the questions were asked. Because if you ask a 5-year-old about that, the ones who are good at counting will say, no, 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 no. You have to start at the left and
Yeah.
you count each
Interesting.
one.
Yeah.
And those were the kids who had the best counting skills, the ones who
Hmm.
applied that who felt that that was the only way to count. And then gradually in grades 1 and 2, there was kind of a switch, so that the kids who were starting to have better numeracy skills now started to understand that you didn't have to count that way. But the ones who were still struggling, now they were starting to use that spatial
Hmm.
that they had. So I would agree with you. I think that there's probably something, a developmental progression that's needed there, that sort of interacts maybe with something like cardinality, right? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
okay. You might understand some aspects of cardinality, but if you're going boom, 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 you're still not going to get the right
You're
answer.
not going to get there. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting.
The other thing I was mentioning, I know Dehan did a paper a long time ago and showed that, and I don't remember what area of the brain it was, but people with certain kinds of brain damage couldn't count because they couldn't keep track of what they had counted. So they were okay with subitizing. They could still say, oh, this is 2 things or 3 things or 4 things. But as soon as you went past 4, they would do that same thing that the kids do, which is they
Hmm.
keep track of what they had counted. So there's some kind of brain process, I guess, that probably is tied in with that attentional process, probably of some sort.
Yeah. Yeah. And just keeping track of relations between objects. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. And I think it happens a lot more than we think. Like counting's a easy kind of early example, but I think when you start to look more broadly at math, like patterning you mentioned earlier, I think it's kind of just there implicitly. It's like a tacit thing. But we don't always recognize it. Um, and maybe some people wouldn't call that spatial thinking, but it's a spatial structuring of sorts. Um, which again, maybe to back to your question, Heather, like that might be different than the way we typically measure spatial thinking as like a psychologist. I'm not sure there would be a correlation, but I still think it's an important aspect of mathematical processing. And maybe that's distinct from like spatial visualization or what you're doing when you're measuring somebody in terms of like mental rotation or these other measures. So it'd be interesting to see how, again, these different aspects of spatial thinking relate to different aspects of mathematical processing.
I'll jump in here because this makes me think of something else. A lot of Montessori education is very much about using structure or keeping structure or finding structure, right? And I just wonder, the question I was going to ask you, Zach, was, do you think that there's actually less focus on spatial processing in schools, sort of in modern schools, than there might have been 30 or 40 years ago? And the reason
Ooh.
that I'm wondering that is because I feel as if we did a lot of things that I would consider spatial in school that I don't see happening so much. And the obvious one is an analog clock versus a digital clock, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kids used to have, because that's the only kind of clock there was. Yeah, and it was hard, and some kids struggled with,
Mm-hmm.
and left and right, and
Yeah.
finding your way around, and organizing I wonder, do you think there's that part of the shift has been away from those kinds of trainings going on in school?
I don't know. That's funny. I haven't really thought about like a change over time. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they're doing like some of the like digital platforms, though, I would say are very spatial. And so maybe that counteracts some of like the lack of maybe what's happening with
But the digital might be spatial in the sense of looking at it, right? And
hmm
realize in mentally, but it's less about physically getting there,
yeah,
right? I was thinking more about the physical, because
the
again, with
physicality piece. Yeah, like the embodied.
yeah, you're using the tools, you're doing things with them, you're developing that relationship between your external, I don't know,
Hmm
vectors or something and what's going on. Whereas a lot of the digital stuff is you're looking at it
Yeah.
and maybe you're visualizing it in your head. And I don't know. I don't,
Yeah. I think it depends on the tool because some of them could draw your attention to the spatial piece in a way that previously just couldn't be done with physical manipulatives. Like there's some neat fraction digital tools that I just think would be really difficult to like explicitly show you what's happening. But I don't know. That's a good question. Like I know of older work using relational rods or Cuisenaire rods, and I would say those are highly spatial, and it seems like people don't use those anymore. But in some ways, I think it's the ultimate manipulative because you can do any sort of mathematics with it. It lends itself to like algebra in terms of like this length plus this length is equivalent to blank plus this length. And that's just one example. You can do addition. You can show all the ways to compose 10 or decompose numbers with these relational lines. So there's that piece, and it seems like those were a much more popular manipulative.
an ab and an abacus
Abacus,
and
yeah, abac,
and a
yeah,
slide rule. I'm happen to be old.
yeah,
We actually learned how to use slide rules. I mean, I kind of feel like if you made a list, there might be actually a
that would
fairly
be
long list
interesting.
of things that just don't happen anymore.
Well,
So
what would be like a new manipulative, like a more recent manipulative that wouldn't have that's being used now that wasn't? I mean, 10 frames, I don't think were being used a lot, but they're kind of a form of abacus.
yeah, a very simplified one. Yeah.
A very simplified one. Again, it's a spatial kind of way of showing the composition of number.
Well, number lines are used more.
Number
We
lines.
never used number lines as kids. Uh,
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, I'll have to write a list and see what I've noticed. And I think it depends on the teacher largely too, and whether or not they're drawing attention to kind of the spatial aspects and using materials in a way that they can be used. I think that's oftentimes where maybe the spatial piece is being neglected or missed out on is that it's there, but again, it's not being used. Like I think even sometimes we forget to ask ourselves, like, why are we using um 10 frames or 5 frames? Like what are they giving us in terms of the affordances? And I think sometimes we just take a tool and hope that it's going to give us some sort of mathematical insight. But I think analyzing it in terms of sometimes the spatial properties and what they're giving us in terms of the mathematics is a useful way of thinking about some of these tools. So, for example, again, relational rods that don't have numbers on them versus the relational rods that do. I would imagine the ones that don't have numbers are going to lend themselves to actually a far richer understanding of the mathematics. And then later you can attach kind of more discrete number, or you can attach a unit to these kind of continuous quantities. Um, Again, that's a study that I'd love to do is just compare those because proportional reasoning we know is really difficult for children and adults. And I think part of that is that we're not thinking about relationships on an ongoing basis. We're thinking about things in very discrete ways, um, and as countable objects, which is really useful. But we also have to know how to attach that to continuous space and see how these things align in terms of like a ruler and like measurement, fractions. There's all sorts of um, aspects of math where I think we need to be thinking in terms of both discrete number, but also how they attach that to continuous properties. And I think thinking about the manipulatives in terms of their affordances could take us a long way there. Jessica, I saw your hand.
Yeah, sorry, I had to jump in when you were talking about relational rods. They are like my favorite tool in the whole world. Like anytime you go to one of those things, it's like if you were a manipulative, I'm like relational rod. Like I just love them so much. I have them in all different sizes and all different colors, and sometimes just because I really nerd out, I'll watch like really old
Yeah.
YouTube videos that show like little
Yeah.
kids in the 60s like using
Yeah.
their relational
Math at
rods.
your fingertips.
Love it.
Those videos are
Uh,
so great. Yeah, if you haven't seen them, you got to see them. They're produced by the Canadian Film Board.
yeah.
And they're so good. And that is another example to your point, Joanne, where basically they're feeling the length of the rods behind their backs and they're doing math by feeling relationships. And by the end of these lessons, these kids are doing like pretty high level algebra in grade one just by feeling the relations between these rods. Yeah, it's the videos, those videos are so good.
So good. Well, and even just like talking about algebra, like that's something that I was thinking when you were talking about the difference between spatial imagery and visual imagery. It's almost like suppressing some of the unnecessary information and thinking spatially. It's maybe a little bit like I'm quicker to generalize, maybe, right? Like I can like let go of some of this stuff and I can think, oh, okay, like what's really happening here is this, and then I can extrapolate, maybe. I don't know. There's something interesting there because I took a picture of that
Hmm.
hot air balloon section and sent it to, because I'm transitioning off of 15 years of being in the classroom to now being in this role. And I sent it to some of my teacher friends, the schematic versus like visual, because that's such a common classroom problem where kids are drawing
Yeah.
the representations in so much detail that's not important for
And they're
solving.
being encouraged to do so. I mean, that's my big worry with any sort of push for visual spatial thinking is that is currently what gets pushed.
Yeah.
Like after our book came out, Taking Shape, that's what I kept on seeing as spatial thinking, this constant encouragement to draw pictures in high detail and draw the math problem.
Mm.
Draw a solution. But the way kids interpret that is to draw things in as much detail as possible. When they hear the word draw, they're not thinking diagram. They're not thinking, let's reduce the complexity and think about like the core mathematical ideas. They hear draw and they go off for 10 minutes and it ultimately might actually be doing more harm than good, unfortunately. So that's my worry. I think we need to be more explicit in what we mean by draw a picture along
Yeah.
with your kind of other solutions to these problems. Yeah.
Just my question real quick, was, I loved Leah's question to open about what you would maybe think differently about, having done that presentation a little while ago. And even I'm just curious, as new in this field, if you were to step back and think of like the change, some major changes or big changes in thinking in like spatial reasoning research that you have noted, like, oh, we used to kind of talk about it this way, and now maybe we're thinking more this way, or anything that stands out.
Yeah, that's hard. It's hard for me to like disconnect my own change from like what's changed in the literature. So, I mean, Joanne, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts over time, how it's changed. I think within the last few years, people have started to consider the mechanisms a lot more. Like it's not just input output. These things are correlated. I mean, I guess I could say that there's good evidence that for 100 years, most of the research has been purely correlational. just showing like, yes, spatial thinking skills, pretty much however we assess it, as long as it's like intrinsic dynamic spatial skills. So more like spatial visualization tends to be highly related to mathematical success across kind of all strands. There's a pretty robust relation there. And I would say only within the last 10 years have people started to test the causal relations. And that's clear just looking at the number of kind of controlled studies to test the effects of interventions. So spatial training, the effects of spatial training on mathematics since 2014. There was one in 2014, and since that time, I've lost count. I recently counted because we did a meta-analysis. I think we're at like 45 studies now. So in a 10-year period, there's been 10 studies trying to causally look at the relationship. But then even there, these still are kind of more like input-output studies. Like if we train just a domain general spatial skill, like let's train people in mental rotation, are they going to get better at math? That's still, I think, kind of the predominant approach, but more people, at least the people that I've been talking to, are starting to think more about what's happening in between. So that's where like the diagram and in your question, Heather, I think is really important. Like if there is something happening here, if people are improving in mathematics because their spatial thinking is improving, what happens in between? Is it because it allows them to schematize the problem? Is it because it allows them to better structure the problem? There's all sorts of potential mechanisms. And again, then maybe that's where it depends on the mathematics at hand and the spatial skills that are being assessed. But I think that's where things are changing a bit. And I think math educators have actually done a really good job at that for kind of a long time, but not in a kind of experimental way necessarily. So I think it's like bringing these worlds together. Like, what do we know from how kids learn mathematics from like a spatial perspective? How can we actually kind of use that as some of the core principles of an intervention and then see whether or not that influences some sort of moderator variable that then impacts the mathematical reasoning. So basically, I think that's my understanding of where we're at, and where the field is kind of going. So again, kind of like your question, Heather, like how do we now test what the relationship is between the spatial piece and then the process piece or the strategy piece? How does it influence strategy change? Because something's happening. I just don't think it's clear what it is. And of these training studies of when people have kind of tried to train cognitive skills and you look for transfer, you don't see it. But there's something coming through with a spatial domain. So if you consider it a domain general skill, I think it has more evidence of transfer than really any other kind of core cognitive capacity. But I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that maybe it's not so domain general, that there's these specific relations that are being leveraged when you train spatial thinking. And that's what's helping the mathematics. It's not just that you're increasing your spatial thinking and that helps you increase your math thinking. I think it's doing something else. And I think it's kind of time to figure out what those things are. How is it changing the way people think mathematically? So hopefully we can figure that out.
I think we had another question.
Hi, it's
Hi,
Jen
Jen.
here.
Hi, Jen. Nice
Yeah,
to see
I'm
you.
from London Catholic. I'm a math facilitator. And so I'm thinking from the classroom lens right now, and I'm in classrooms in mathematics classrooms every day, collaborating with educators. So it's great to hear the research piece. I've been using your work, Zach, from taking shape for a lot of years now.
A lot of years, yeah.
Quite a few years now. And a lot of this conversation is making me really think about our current Ontario mathematics curriculum, and thinking about how that continuum, if we're looking at the continuum, and I'm thinking about this spatial thinking when I think about that whole strand that we have, thinking grade 1 to 8, and how it is, students don't just develop a
No.
space, like they don't without, and you were bringing up the idea about concrete materials and those sort of things. Like when I think about, I'm immersed right now in grade 3,
Hmm.
And how do you develop an idea of congruency without, right, having that opportunity of manipulating and then I'm thinking about educators, how they always ask me, and I know that's something that you were talking about, how to measure pieces of spatial thinking beyond the pencil paper task ask.
Hmm.
So I always find that fascinating because I do think there are some correlations that we see as I would say, I don't, as not as a researcher, but as an educator, I would see that those pieces happening within the
Hmm.
classroom. Um, what other question? I did have another question. Any like specific opportunities would you say for educators like that really stand alone that build that learning for students? And I would
Like
say,
in terms of like spatial sense, like,
yeah, like
yeah,
multiple opportunities. Like when I
I
think about
think
mental
multiple. I think
rotation,
it's about
repetition, is it more of that like
I think
building that
so. Yeah. I
if
think
you
you need
haven't had
lots
that
of
opportunity?
practice.
Okay.
And I think if you're going to use it as a strategy, like a way of thinking mathematically, it can't just be a one-off. It can't just be a 2-week unit on geometric transformations. It'd have to be something that's sustained and spaced out, distributed, to like borrow
Yeah.
a cognitive science term, like
Mhm.
something you're doing on a regular basis. And that was the
Space.
idea behind taking shape. Like again, some of those activities I think are pretty distant from like some of the mathematics. And yet I would still advocate for a lot of the activities, just in that it's providing students with practice and thinking in a different mathematical way. Like it's opening their spatial sense. Like it's giving them this
Exactly. I
practice, this habit
know.
of mind. And I think that's really important for spatial reasoning because we don't do it. It would be different if like we regularly did think in a spatial way, but over and over again, I see the same thing in classrooms, and I did when I was in the classroom. Like kids just don't go there because they're not taught that. And as adults, I don't think most of us weren't taught to think in a very spatial way, or to translate like numerical information or word problems into a spatial way, which isn't always helpful, but it can be helpful. And I think if you have
Exactly.
that habit of mind, it can get you to start thinking in a spatial way and hopefully able to recognize when it is a helpful
Okay.
tool. Um, so yeah, to your question though, I think you need explicit. Like if I were to go back and write a second version of that book, I think I'd be even more explicit
Okay.
in the link between some of those activities or a whole range of new activities and their relationship to mathematics.
Right. I know because often
Yeah,
educators will say, okay, but that I don't see that in this particular curriculum expectation,
yeah,
say grade
yeah.
two,
Where
right?
is it? How
But
does
where
it?
is that in the curriculum, right? Where is it bird's eye view where they're manipulating, right? Which it is embedded in there, but it may
Yeah,
not be explicit to them. So um I know it's
yeah,
making me think about like systemly how we can incorporate and more opportunities in the learning
yeah.
for
And
educators to see that thinking.
it would be neat to document more of these cases too in the classroom, like your perspective and other people's perspective that are seeing these things on a daily basis. And I think
Right,
that would help us also better understand what these potential like mechanisms are. Where are these things? Where is spatial reasoning helping students and where is it hindering their understanding? And just having a better understanding of the day-to-day use of spatial reasoning. It's the lowest kind of scores in the EQAO test,
well, and
which
that
is
was my
which is a
other
bit of a
piece.
mystery, right? When you look across the board from grade 3, grade 6, grade 9, and if you look at international assessments like PISA and TIMSS, that's what differentiates countries, the high performing ones from the
Right,
more middle usually. It's that understanding of how they translate a given problem into some other model that allows
right,
you to
and
reason about it differently and then gives you a solution. And that's where I don't think we do a great job of that in Ontario. And I think it shows in the EQAO. I think we
yeah,
take for
yeah,
granted what kids can do spatially. Like, I don't think kids readily understand a unit, a spatial unit, when we're thinking about measurement. And I think that's a really difficult concept for kids, but for adults, it might not be so difficult. And so I think that's like another like I think there's tons that we could basically just go back and look at where kids are struggling. And I think oftentimes it's that they're not understanding kind of the concept from a spatial perspective. Not always, but
Right.
sometimes they just don't have a model. Even
Right.
fractions, you ask kids to
Yeah.
draw a fraction, they always draw a pi.
They
And it's a
always, oh
terrible
yeah,
model for thinking about fractions. And they're
I
so
know.
limited in their thinking. They can't divide a circle into 5 pieces and then they're stymied, they're stuck. They can't go beyond that. So even that's
Yeah.
like an example of a bad spatial model. And if we had better instruction at like thinking about fractions on a number line, thinking about a rectangular model, an array model,
Yeah.
those to me are spatial models that would hopefully encourage a whole other level of mathematical thinking. And we don't see that, but that's where I think a lot of the difficulties lie.
I
And
know. I totally agree. That was my other piece was that EQAO piece because we hear the EQAO side from it from an from the board level hearing. Okay, now we see the spatial sense piece, and we're like, okay, how do we? What's the next piece of learning that we need to engage educators in as well? So, but no, thank you, Zach. I always appreciate hearing.
it's
Uh,
good to see you.
yeah, nice to see you too.
We have to talk about the fraction study that we did with your
Yes.
board. That's a whole other project, but I have lots to say
Yeah.
about that and share.
Uh, thanks.
I wonder if part of
Okay,
the answer
so
to just 1 second, Leah, that part of the answer to this question is captured really nicely with a lot of the things we're talking about, which is that external models, using them, linking them to specific math things, that's not just not going on enough, and it's not going on consistently. And they're not using multiple different models because for anybody, analogical reasoning is quite hard, right?
Hmm.
So just because you know something in this context doesn't mean that you can translate it to another context. So maybe this solution here is finding the array of tools that would help kids think spatially and do things spatially, and then also helping them to connect them together. So it's like,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think
And
that's a good summary.
helping the teachers understand how to use the tools effectively, like working with the teachers and how you can train that too is important.
Yeah.
Hmm. And why, and recognizing which models afford which aspect, like different levels of
Yes.
reasoning.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
pi model gives you one way of thinking about fractions, but a number line gives you a whole other way. And how does the actual visual spatial layout of a model give you different kind of mathematical insights, which is a really hard thing to do. But I think if we just started to think about it,
Mhm.
it would take us to a nice place where we could actually then start being more critical about the representations and kind of externalized like visualizations that we use. Like the Singaporean bar model, I think is a great way of taking kind of complex problems and in some ways, again, spatializing it, but it's a way of simplifying the complexity in like a really nice way. In a way that I would say is superior to kind of these other ways of dealing with word problems that we know don't work so well, where you're kind of just looking for keywords and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, but I think that yeah, it's a challenge.
okay, so as we wrap up, I just have one final question for you, Zach. If you could have elementary school teachers take one thing away from your talk about spatial reasoning and early mathematics, what would that be? Sorry, hard question.
I no, I think it's a great question. I think it kind of relates to what I was trying to just say. I'm not sure if I was being articulate enough, but I like actually just recognize how much of your practice is spatial and in which cases are certain models or representations helpful and when are they not? I think again, like really just starting to look at things from a spatial lens, I think can open up our eyes to all sorts of ways of looking at children's thinking and then also thinking about our own thinking. Like maybe this model isn't good because it's so limited, we can't do much with it. Um, and so I think just recognizing already where spatial reasoning is or is not taking place and then how it relates to the tools that we use in our practice. So in short, I think recognition first and then starting to kind of use that as a basis to kind of dive further into all the possibilities that lie ahead if we start thinking more critically about the use or lack thereof of spatial reasoning. I think it's there.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys so much all for coming. And thank you, Zach, for the amazing answers to all of our questions. And yeah, this has been our first AIM Collective Conversations. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Leah. Thanks for organizing.
Thank you for being our first speaker.
Yeah,
That was amazing. You did a great job.
yeah, hopefully it was okay. Yeah.